Hello and welcome to our fourth week in the Future Punk series of lectures. So today we want to look a bit into world building from not so much the perspective how the world looks like. I mean, is it more yellow or green, or is it more in the global south, or more in the northwestern hemisphere, or wherever you might think of things that make a world complete. We want to look into the abstract mechanics and philosophy by which you can build a world in which your future happens. So, and over the last 500 years or so, at least speaking of the European history of mind, there has been kind of a divide of two basic forms of defining the world as you want the world to happen in your creation. The first is utopia. So this nice rendering, actually I don't know the artist who did that, but I've seen it many times, is the inside of a big toroid space station. So the space station rotates. We have seen pictures of that in the first lecture, and the centrifugal force presses everything to the outside, and so you can have lakes and oceans, even these suspension bridges and cities, and the way the torus turns around the sun gives even a terminator that marks a line between where it's day and where it's night. We'll look into actual experiments in building utopian settlements on Earth to try out how that would work a bit later. If you take an image search on Utopia, we have to subtract Amazon here for the reason that Amazon issued a TV series of that name, and that completely destroys your Google search. You see that these pictures are somehow, I would say, related in style. It's a bit like the space picture that we saw in the first. I mean, even in the left down corner here, where you see Joseph Stalin, the chairman of the Communist Russian Party and leader of the Soviet Union in the Second World War, clearly an ambiguous figure to say the least. You see the connection of utopia with ideas that a society might be shaped in an utopian way. Let's see the basic history of that, and that everything will become very clear soon. The word utopia, although it is Greek, is about 500 years old and was coined by Thomas Morus. So Thomas More was a politician and philosopher in the times around 1500, so a bit more than 500 years ago. And at that time, the church had not yet split. So in Europe, there was just the Catholic Church, and in Eastern Europe, there was the Orthodox Church. But the Catholic Church was the only church so far in the region that is today the European Union and Great Britain. And that, however, had already dark clouds rising, which was called the Reformation. So in many places, like in Switzerland or in Germany, also in England, people would oppose the Catholic Church and would have criticisms, mostly driven by the rising wealth in the cities of people who saw the Catholic Church, the Catholicism, as being very conservative, being in the way of them doing trades, in particular exploring the world and going on their excursions in colonialism. And in particular in England there was a king, Henry VIII, and Henry VIII was very much in competition with Spain, the Spanish king, Philip II at that time, sending vessels all over the Americas and conquering and plundering the Americas, and Henry VIII was of course envious of that, and saw the problem in his marriage to Philip's daughter, and so he wanted to divorce her and defeat the Spanish fleet, and the church was just in the way of that, and so he split the English church from the continental church and founded the Anglican, the Church of England, in this act of reformation, so that he could have his divorce on the one hand and then go to war with the Spanish and defeat the Armada, the Spanish fleet, and then build his own colonial empire. So that was the mindset of people at that time. I mean, of course, you could also say that the Catholic Church at that time was in really rough shape. There was a lot of corruption going on and so on. So criticism from all sides. And the interesting thing with the idea of utopia is it is actually documenting this religious struggle of the time. So we have Henry VIII, the King of England, for whom the Catholic Church is too conservative and too much in religious things kind of in his way. And we have Thomas Morus, who was a successful politician. He was even the Chancellor for Henry VIII for a while, writing this book totally on the other side. He says everything is way too worldly and too bourgeois, and we have to find our way back to a good society that is beyond profiteering. And so Morus, in 1516, which is 1 year before Luther starts the same kind of process of reformation that has happened in England at that time, also in Germany and the continental Europe, then splitting the church, starting the Protestant church, the Lutheran church. So at 1516, More publishes this book Utopia about an island, of course a fantasy, an imaginary island, on which a society lives in prosperity and total equality without any private property. So the word utopos in Greek means no space. And that is already actually telling you the story of utopia. That doesn't mean that it's a good place, as people often translate that, because that in Greek would be oitopos. Oitopos is the good place, and dystopos is the bad place. But utopos means the no place. So for Morus, that is of course totally clear that a place like Utopia could never exist on Earth. And that has been the idea of utopian philosophy, of utopian political ideas, that they can never be achieved because they are totally out of what is possible with human nature, with the nature that surrounds us, but also, I mean, with the factuality of our lives. Then More knew that. So it is a political book that points towards a possible future of society, although knowing that the future that he actually describes here will never be reached. There's a lot of interesting things here. So he invents this the figure, the kind of a pirate or merchant or so, Portuguese Raphael Hytlodaeus. Hytlodaeus is this a traveler on the vessel of Amerigo Vespucci, one of the Italian conquerors of the Americas, after whom America gets named. And Hytlodaeus comes back and tells Morus the story, so that is how the plot goes, of this island, Utopia, that has many cities. Every city is alike, they are all the same, a maximum of 6,000 people living in households of maximum of 16 people each. The households are not really families, because there is no clear marriage life or anything like that. So it is even more egalitarian. Although, I mean, people marry, but they can be divorced and can kind of have their children educated jointly. So it is a very kind of socialist future that Morus points here. They all wear uniform clothes from very simple fabric made, and they have slaves. So in our view, that might actually be not so great, but for Morus that was probably a great way of putting away prisoners of war and other convicts that fell in disgrace. So these are the slaves, and every household of 16 people has at least 2 slaves. So this is utopia, not so utopian from our point of view, I guess. Oh yeah, and old people are euthanized, so no one falls on costs of the society. So very radical in that way, and totally emancipated. Men and women can both be priests. In the details, it's not so emancipated after all. So just pointing that out, because that is the first book that actually had that name, Utopia, and that is seen as also the first idea of an utopia, describing this world that could not be. Yeah, and from that we have the utopian writing, we have the dystopia, a world in which we don't want to live, and most of science fiction is of course the latter. There is very few science fiction that point this utopia, the good places. Morus had many successors, so this is Johann Gottfried Schnabel, a German author about 150 years later, writing a book called Insel Felsenburg, which means Island of the Rock Castle. It's very similar, and if you read that, it already paints a society that is probably in the spirit of the American and the French Revolution. So very, very enlightened. The society on the Insel Felsenburg is very much held together by education, and so it is a meritocracy of people of high education. Then we have more satirical views on that, like Ludwig Holberg's Travels of Niels Klim. So Niels Klim is this adventurer and scientist who travels into a volcano and discovers that the earth is hollow from the inside. That was an interesting theory at that time, so people were thinking, I mean, if the earth is kind of hot inside, so why doesn't it blow up? I mean, it's at that time when Newton came up with his gravity, and then came the other people and say, if the Earth would actually be fully kind of gravitational, why wouldn't it just collapse? What does it keep from collapsing? And then we'll say, well, actually it must be hollow from the inside. So there must be a hollow space, and we see that, I mean, there's all the caves, so you can go inside. And even people would think, well, maybe that is actually, for example, in the book of Enoch, which is kind of an apocryphal book of late antiquity. Enoch describes this mountain of the north, which the sun goes around the mountain of the north, and people live on a continent around this mountain of the north, and day and night come just from the sun going around this mountain, and the mountain casts its shadow. And people say, well, that doesn't make much sense. Everyone knows that the earth is round, so kind of how would that work? But inside the earth you could imagine something like that going on. So they would kind of collage together these various apocryph and esoteric ideas. And Holberg, the Swedish author Niels Holberg, makes fun of it, Danish actually, I'm sorry, makes fun of it in this book, having this underworld being totally whimsical. So there's these tree people and actually making fun of society in particular, of aristocracy, of the clergy, and so on. So it's a very fun book to read. And there's others with similar ideas. For example, Jonathan Swift, an English author, Gulliver's Travels. It's very similar idea. So Gulliver is this traveler going to the island of Lilliput, and the people are all very tiny, but in the end they are super bureaucratic, and he has to flee because he, as this big person, has no space there. And then he comes to the other island, which is the island of Brobdingnak, and there's all these giants, and he is now the tiny one, but that doesn't work either. And everything that he observed there is basically just a satire of the society at his time. So this is often in utopian writing throughout the centuries in European history, that people make fun of their time, which they couldn't do so much in the open because of censorship and also because of moral. It was not only the censorship by the king or by society as such, but it was also that you couldn't just say things openly without being an outcast and being excluded from society. And these satirical, very well written literature examples of novels that take place in places that don't exist would travel through this kind of narrow canal between the two crushing kind of rocks that you have to avoid. So this is the history of Utopia. So I just wanted to share with you this website that I stumbled upon. So Ecotopia, since the 1970s, when I think the first book that name came out, has always been kind of another topia. It's kind of the utopia that is kind of ecologically great. And here you see all these artworks about the fantasy of or the imaginative cities. So let's look into these cities. Can explore that here, and maybe it's not everyone's dream of Tokyo in the future to look like that. But you clearly see the approach here. So you define a world that is utopian in terms of ecology. So you not necessarily reduce the number of people living, but somehow the ecological footprint of people gets different and everything gets resolved. And then you have these sustainable cities. Everything is green and lush, and people live in their conurban dwellings. Yeah, this utopian, building an utopian city that is ecologically sustainable has been attempted several times over the hundreds of years. There have been religious utopian movements like the Hutterins that were a radical Protestant sect or group of people who left Germany around 1600 and walked basically all the way through Siberia, crossed the Bering Strait, and then from Alaska went down into Canada and Northern America, and they're still around there. If you at the border in the Midwest, I mean, you see Hutterins settlements. I mean, they're totally they deny kind of any kind of private property or so. I mean, they live in this kind of very social, family-oriented way. They are not like the Amish or the Mennonites, which are similar sects, that they don't, so they are allowed to use technology, for example, for agriculture or so, but they don't have anything for themselves, so they don't need smartphones and anything like that. Just to mention that there has been a history of these utopian communities trying to build heaven on earth. This is usually the idea. But in particular, in the 20th century, that has become a bit more systematic in the sense of actually using also technology and things that keep things together. So one particularly interesting approach of that is the Biosphere project, Biosphere 2, which is in southern Arizona in the southwest of the United States. So that was started in 1987. Basically, was a billionaire, one of the richest people in the US, Ed Bass, is his name. He funded that with 150 million US dollars, which I mean in current money would probably be like 3 or 4 times as much. So say like $500 million in today's money to build this spaceship Earth. That was the idea. We will come to these ideas that think of kind of a messianic future in a later lecture. That is the idea of an American philosopher, Buckminster Fuller. And for this spaceship Earth, to try out what that actually means, they built this compound that's completely contained. So the idea that Bayes had, and inviting an ecologist, a scientist by the name of John Allen to run the thing for him, was to have a community of people living for years, ideally, completely secluded from the rest of the world. So the only thing that goes in and out is sunlight and heat at night. So basically the idea is to have a space station on Earth. I mean, today we discuss going to Mars again, I mean, 40 years later. And so people think of reviving that program. I mean, it is still there. You can visit it. I've seen it from a distance. I think at the time when I went there, the admission tickets were too expensive for my taste. So I just looked at it in my early 20s and saw, okay, this is it. This is why I have this this article here and not my own pictures that I can share with you. The project failed ultimately, so there was no real use case and it really didn't work out that well. And the interesting thing why it didn't work out is that the people inside started to really get on each other's nerves. So what happened that inside the biosphere, at first people broke in groups that were compete with each other on the very limited resources, of course. And since no one thought of defining the rules in the first place, so no one was in charge inside, there was no hierarchy, everyone was on the same level, people said, why should I follow what you asked me to do? Do what I say, and then maybe you do, then I do what you say. And that led in the end to an almost dictatorial regime of 2 of the researchers inside, and people were totally unhappy and just left. So this is also very interesting that this great utopian plan so thoroughly failed. And it will be very interesting to revive it now with the things we know now. And we have seen also people living on the International Space Station for many months, even a year, and surviving that, but it requires a lot of self-discipline and a lot of determination to keep your things together in a situation like that. So that is an actually utopian place, but it exists. So it is. It has its topos. It's not utopos. It really exists in the physical world. You can go there and visit it. So this is utopian thinking. And now we go to the right opposite of that. So utopian thinking, you have your great plan of society and the world on the and things become nice and beautiful by political and social forces. And the opposite side of that is futurism. So futurism is a techno-determinist movement. And let's look where the word comes from. So this is in Turin in northern Italy. Turin is in the northwest of Italy, and what you see here, where Professor Heather is standing, is the original Fiat car factory. So Fiat built until the early 1990s, when things went really bad for them, built actually cars inside it. Now it's offices and a shopping mall. But it used to be where most of the Fiat cars were built until recently. It was built originally in 1921, so after the First World War. Italy at that time was not one of the most industrialized countries in Europe. It was a bit behind, to say the least, and so very agricultural and a very conservative place. And people like the Agnelli family, who owned Fiat, who started thinking of what to do with their car brand, said we have to build a new society, and we make our car factory show that. And what you see here on the roof is a race course for cars. So on the 8th or 9th floor, you have this race course where people in the 1920s would have car races. And I mean, if you see that, I mean, there's no railing really. So people would literally drive across the over the edge and just fall down 9 floors and die. And that was celebrated as a martyrdom, as a beautiful death, like people in some countries celebrate people who die in war as war heroes. So that was the war against the past. It was the war for the future, that you would fight with machines, you would fight with the cars against everything that the past would hold back. Yeah, and the spirit behind that had been conceived right before the First World War, like maybe 5 years earlier, when a group of men around the poet Filippo Tommaso Marinetti wrote their Futurist Manifesto. So the Futurists, I think they had a glass too many and were a bit intoxicated, were driving their new car in the early 1900s. They were driving their car into the dip, the side of the road, and the car was damaged and they were all injured, and they were saying, well, that was great. It's a bit like people here in the Emirates driving on the motorways with totally insane speeds and not keeping any distance or so, and thinking it's probably great to have a car accident. People in Italy at that time probably found that not usually so much appealing to die in a car accident, but for the young poet and his painter and architect friends, that was exactly it. And then they wrote this manifesto, which you have in the readings, so you know what it says. And one of the very strong claims here is, we want to destroy the libraries and the academies of all kind, and fight against moralism, against feminism, and all the cowardness that relies on convenience, on selfishness. So, I mean, clearly that is a very right-leaning philosophy that we read here. It's not at all soft. There is no idea of equality or friendliness towards other genders. It's very hard and celebrating war. And when First World War then broke out, the futurists would celebrate that and go into war and fight for its own sake. Then in the 1920s, futurism fueled literally the Italian Revolution. So Italy had its revolution right after the First World War, as many European countries. And while some of the countries in Europe, like like Russia, had a left-leaning revolution, a socialist revolution, or others like Germany had a liberal revolution, a kind of social democrat revolution, overthrowing the emperor, sending him into exile and forming a democracy. In Italy, it was different. The Italian revolution was fueled by these futurist ideas to build a technocratic society that would break with the past and its leader, Benito Mussolini, called the movement the Fascists. Fascists is referring to ancient Rome, actually, because the high judges that would have the right for capital punishment would carry a bundle of wigs and an axe, and that was called the fasces. So that is kind of a play on this antique times. It's also, of course, a symbol of the French Revolution, these fasces. So that was Mussolini's idea. Let's just kind of be like the French in their revolution and make tabula rasa, end everything that's old. And here you see one of the things how that should look like. So this is the so-called Torre Littoria, which was the first high-rise building in Turin. In the old city, Turin has a very old high-rise also. From the 19th century is very beautiful, but it's a bit outside, so it doesn't destroy the view that the king would have from his palace. So this is the Palazzo Reale. This is where the king has his palace, the House of Savoy, and the building that Mussolini would build as the fascist headquarter, the fascist party's headquarter, would be directly in the view of the king, and would be totally different than the Enlightenment style, the Baroque style of the otherwise very homogeneously Baroque city of Turin. So this was, of course, meant as showing the old powers who was in charge now, with radical modernity, with radical modernism. The painters of the futurist movement would celebrate the speed and energy, like here Luigi Russolo, the dynamics of the automobile, and this joy of driving and of the motor, and that bringing the new life is the futurist creed. So this is a street built by Mussolini around Lake Garda in the early fascist years, and what I want to show you is that this street that Mussolini built is the first modern road in this Alpine region, totally cuts through this beautiful, otherwise beautiful Rococo Palazzo, Palazzo Bettoni from 1750 around. So it completely destroys the palace, but it doesn't even bother in completely tearing it down. It just cuts through as a kind of a disgrace for the old powers. Yeah, here Gino Severini, the suburban train arriving in Paris, another great example of futurist art, and you get the point, I mean, of the world building here. It is the world being torn apart by machines with all the force of the new motors that are available. Umberto Boccioni, that's a very famous statue, this figure moving ahead, and very radical also the architecture here. That's a post office building in Milan, or here this is in Padua. See this kind of very strong hard lines, then often combined with styles of the antiquities. Here this is the courtyard of the University of Padua, which is the oldest university in Europe, or one of the 2 or 3 oldest. And then the play with new materials also. So this is again from the Fiat factory. This used to be a steel foundry in Turin. This staircase is leading from the floor where the foundry was, where all the molten metal would be cast into the molds for building the cars, and on the first floor, the so-called piano nobile, directly above the stinking and the heat and all of this metal smelting foundry, of the steel foundry would be the apartments of the top management of Fiat. So they would live in the same building where the metal would be cast. And the staircase no one forgot to put plaster on it. It's meant to look like naked concrete. It's a very early example of the so-called brutalism in English. So brut means naked, and raw in that sense. The raw concrete is the concrete brut. And by the way, this is the building where Arduino sits. This is in Turin, where the Arduino is built. So they sit in the same building then where the Fiat would cast their metal. Also, to establish the Italian fascism in the territories that used to be not Italian, the architecture and the art of the futurists played a large role. So this is in Pula, in the south of Istria, which is in Croatia, and that used to be part of Austria-Hungary, and in 1918. In the peace treaties of the Paris kind of small castles, in these peace treaties, Austria-Hungary was cut in pieces, and basically people tried to somehow build these ethno-national new countries, like for example Yugoslavia. But Istria was like half settled by Croats and Italians and Germans or Austrians, whatever. And so it was just said, well, that is more Italian than Croat, so let's put it to the Italians. And that was, of course, very unfortunate, because Mussolini would expel all the Croats, and many 100,000 of Croats went to exile in the United States, but also to other parts of Yugoslavia. So it's a huge injustice that happened at that time. Italy put their infrastructure here. This is the post office, one of 6 post offices in Pula. And if you look at the inside, I mean, it is totally spectacular from the design and architecture. So you see these letters. They are aluminium, so all the fixtures are aluminium, which was incredibly expensive at that time. Like all the doors are made from aluminium. Aluminium became much cheaper over the 1920s and 30s, but at that time was still very precious. And you see the staircase again, I mean, with this red mosaic. I mean, it is a very beautiful architectural statement. And so the architect Angiolo Manzoni, who is also well known for the main station in Venice, so Venezia Santa Lucia, which is also this spectacular modernist buildings from the same time. This is a design for the so-called Corso Reale, the main street in Turin, and you see kind of this utopian city that is planned here. It's a bit like Brasilia in the 1960s, then was built in Brazil as this fantasy of a city that is just planned, and the same here with Turin. And speaking of occupied land, I mean, in 1935, Italy invaded Ethiopia, and which was a horrible injustice, of course, and tried to subject Ethiopia to Italian colonialism. And that failed ultimately. The Ethiopians very successfully fought back under great losses, and Mussolini had to call Hitler for help, and this is why Hitler then entered the war in Africa, which cost then basically the superiority of Germany in the Mediterranean, because the British troops in North Africa were very successfully fighting against the Germans and so on. So the history here is very dark, but I want to share with you this image of this this power plant in Massawa in Ethiopia. If you look at the staircase, also the spiral staircase and the designs. And then, of course, to show that it is in an exotic place, you have people riding on a camel here. To make it more oriental, to make it more colonial. So there is a strong connection of this techno-determinist futurism and fascism. The connection is on many levels interesting for our context today, not so much for this class, but for communication and technology or politics of code, because a lot of it is still very present in the culture, for example, in Silicon Valley. This is why, for example, Wired magazine has this article, so how futurism and fascism connect and how that matters in terms of dreaming up a techno-determinist world. And thinking of building a world, I mean, the objective that you have to come up with in this class, I mean, of course, you might not so much care if that is good or bad, as long as it tells a good story in your futurist world. So come up with a techno-determinist future, but keep it plausible by learning how much it relates to political authoritarianism. This, just to move a bit outside the Italian context, so this is a movie poster of the Fritz Lang movie 1926 Metropolis, that has spectacular futurist design and great robots also. It is a very long silent movie, but very good music to it. You will find it on YouTube. I can only recommend watching it. It's one of the most beautifully shot black and white movies, I think. And politically, it's a total disaster. It is completely fascist, even years before the Nazis in Germany would take power. And the irony is, of course, Fritz Lang is Jewish and had immediately in 1933 to emigrate to the United States and flee the Nazis. So this is Ludwig Mies van der Rohe, one of the leading architects in the Bauhaus. Mies van der Rohe has these visions of skyscrapers that in Europe he could never fulfill. He had to emigrate also and went to the United States and started with other architects together what's called the Chicago School of Architecture, which is this very strict and block-looking skyscraper that you see in many American cities. I mean, in particular, of course, in Chicago, but also in New York. And then the American kind of futurist-inspired architects like Frank Lloyd Wright. You might know the Guggenheim Museum in New York. This is a futurist vision for the Madison Civic Center in Madison, Wisconsin. That Frank Lloyd Wright here depicts. So a lot of things, a lot of the buildings of Frank Lloyd Wright are kind of between kind of an utopian idea of living and a futurist vision of a technological society. So the futurist creed, very well expressed here by Gabriele D'Annunzio, one of the futurist poets, also fascist poets, one of the, I would say, most popular poets and writers of the 20th century in Italy. He's still venerated as one of the greatest Italian poets. Is here this kind of saying that the world is a play of the thoughts and sentiments of superior men. And of course it means men, it doesn't mean humans. So D'Annunzio is an interesting guy also because in First World War he was commanding a naval vessel in the Adriatic Sea, and the World War ended, and D'Annunzio was kind of unsatisfied, says, yeah, now it's over or what? And so he took his ship and went over to what would then become Yugoslavia, and occupied the city of Rijeka. So Rijeka is in the north of Croatia. It's a harbor city, and over the centuries was inhabited by Croats, by Austrians, by people from Venice or so. So it's a kind of a multicultural city. It looks like really a mixture of all these cultures. And then came D'Annunzio and occupied it. And what he did there is he installed his totally kind of utopian government, this model fascist government, which was of course totally cruel. And brutal, and with no real concept other than just for the fun of it, you could really say, because he never really planned to stay there. And then he went home and wrote books and so on, and was greatly celebrated as this hero of Rijeka. I mean, so much that he became really a threat to Mussolini, the Italian fascist dictator, who feared D'Annunzio's popularity. So Mussolini would literally bribe D'Annunzio and pay him huge amounts of money to shut up. And so D'Annunzio has this totally over-the-top house at Lago di Garda called the Vittoriale. So, and with this idea of this kind of these strong men, these superior men forging the future, as if that would be a play, totally cynical. We can move on to other kind of futurist-inspired art and ideologies, which clearly is, of course, the Soviet art of the Soviet modernism. So what you see here is Halina Zubchenkova, mosaic outside the Kiev Institute for Nuclear Research. And what these guys are clearly doing here is kind of unleashing the power of atomic energy. So this is another futurist dream, of course. The atomic energy will be kind of endless, and so why not just have our atomic weapons and atomic power plants and whatever, and use this energy, and no matter if people die. I mean, isn't it great that we have that kind of under our control so much? So I mean, this is really a great piece. I mean, it's all its modernity. I mean, see these engineers kind of tampering with the nucleus, and then the rays go off and they can steer it to, and of course, I mean, we all know where that went, because 10 years later, also in the Ukraine, Chernobyl power plant exploded and created one of the worst environmental disasters that ever happened, and probably was kind of crucial for seeing the Soviet Union going down. Yeah, and then, I mean, after the Chernobyl disaster, the later Republic of Belarus, who took most of the radiation, most of the radioactive fallout, dedicated this tapestry to the United Nations. It is in display on the United Nations headquarters in New York. And that is clearly using these motives of socialist concretivism, of this strong imagery, but shows what happens if you unleash the powers. So that should be it now for the history of futurism. I mean, in this kind of combination of futurism, totalitarianism, in particular fascism, kind of this these horrors, and now we come to neo-futurism, which is a movement that then after the Second World War particularly found its way into architecture. One of the main proponents is Richard Rogers. Here you see Lloyd's London in the city of London. It's a super impressive and beautifully made building, like a big machine. Another building that you might know is the Paris Centre Pompidou exhibition center, right in the middle of Paris. So it's also by Richard Rogers. So that is Rogers with his idea of the building as a machine, but much more, I would say, in this neo-futurism influential was the Iraqi architect Zaha Hadid. So Zaha Hadid was born in 1950 in Baghdad and studied in Beirut, and then mostly from her architectural office from her firm in London, she became the main mind of an art that was called or is called parametricism. So the idea of parametricism is not so much building these big machines as Richard Rogers did, but use computers and build things that you cannot do just by using paper and pencil. And Zaha Hadid built a lot of things here around the Gulf. For example, the Sheikh Zayed Bridge here in Abu Dhabi, which is a spectacular kind of almost calligraphic form. Another spectacular design here is the BR Environmental Corporation in Sharjah, and here you see this halfway organic or alien shape lying in the Sharjah desert. So Zaha Hadid leads over to a specific form of futurism that we will discuss in its own lecture at the end of this series, which is Gulf futurism. It's a very specific form of envisioning the future in a very technocratic, in a techno-optimistic way. And I mean, of course, in Dubai, that's most obvious if you think of the Museum of the Future and other architectural highlights of the city of Dubai. There's much going on in that, like the Burj Khalifa. Here in Abu Dhabi, things are much calmer and much more rational, but nevertheless, I mean, the ideas certainly are falling on a very fruitful soil here. So we will look into the Gulf futurism much more in detail. Yeah, and what does that all mean? I mean, what I want you to do is to research into these manifestos and understand that what they do, why are they called manifestos? Because they manifest, they make things tangible. So they define what you want. So that is the initial state of world building. Write down your rules. This is the rule by which our world will work. And then you could think of insurgencies and people who say, well, your rules sound nice, but they don't apply to me. I will not care. And by that come up with interesting stories. So in the time after Second World War, this totally male, white European way of building the future, because men can do that, this idea of this hard futurist thinking was challenged in the colonial criticism, but also, of course, in gender criticism and in the fight for racial justice. And certainly this idea of manifest destiny, which is one of the founding myths of the United States, so that there is this destiny which becomes manifest in settling and colonizing North America, is this movie Space is the Place by Sun Ra from 1974. It's a very funny movie, and I show you a bit of it.
Look, why don't you just hang in here? I'll get my attorney. I think we can still work this thing out.
I will measure you by the disciplines of your black ancestors. Your acceptance may not be what you expect.
Well, I'll take my chances.
Wait! You cannot take the black part of you with you. I'll take the black part with me.
The movement for which this movie is a very early example is called Afrofuturism. And in the readings you find this very good text that I want you to read by Alondra Nelson. Alondra Nelson is about my age, is an American writer and academic, and she has just been nominated by the American President Biden as Deputy Director of the Office of Science and Technology Policy. So this is the background is technology criticism and science criticism to create a just world of science and technology, which brings us back to this criticism of futurism as being first of all basically male European, but also thinking of people as unequal. And so this text that I've seen looked out for you here is in which Alondra Nelson explains what Afrofuturism should be and can be. And many things that you find in there are absolutely crucial to understand, also thinking of your world building and beyond, of course, for your life. One is the concept of being othered. So of no matter if you are citizen or long time resident or so in a country, that you are still not part of what you feel would be society, which the American philosopher W.E.B. Du Bois more than 120 years ago called double consciousness. So he describes himself as having the great advantage of being sent to university as a black man in a time when it was basically still unthinkable, and getting an education and becoming a scholar, but still, so becoming part of a kind of a cultural elite, but still knowing that you are never part of it actually, because the rules are made by other people. So there is people, I mean, they might invite you even to sit on the same table or so, but you are never actually part of their group. And that creates this feeling of having two consciousnesses, and always feeling that there is a master and slave relationship that governs your life. And I think that Alondra Nelson deconstructs futurist thinking very well in that respect. So I think for world building, knowing where it comes from, both utopian thinking and futurist thinking, and take that, look at Afrofuturism and the other approaches that similarly build worlds, deconstructing the colonial reality of the 20th century. So you find readings here, the manifesto, for example, by the Italian futurists that you hopefully have all read already, and other manifestos So absolute great one is Martin Sims' Mundane Afrofuturist Manifesto. And here you see what kind of an early 21st century take on Afrofuturism allows. So 50, 60 years after the civil rights movement, it is possible to have a manifesto looking both backwards and forwards. And what she writes here, of course, is criticizing kind of these kitschy versions. So, oh, we are all children of the stars. That no, this is not true, and we don't want kind of these kitschy utopian futures in our science fiction, and also warning that just because people are othered, like for example because being black or being of another ethnic or cultural background, that makes them other to the cultural majority, that doesn't mean that they make good aliens. And that is of course a bit criticizing space is the place, that kind of has this idea of an appropriation or reappropriation of African culture, this Egyptian style that Sun Ra wears like a pharaoh also, and then kind of telling the oppressed black people that they should come with him and kind of leave their world life behind. I mean, the movie is of course more complicated than that, and please accept my apologies for telling these things, being not at all entitled to do that, and I know that, and I find it very difficult, but I don't want to deprive you from seeing that. So please take everything that I say with the necessary grain of salt, that I am a European white man with all my privilege. So, and then there is things that we can find funny in our science fiction, but they're actually very tacky. So, yeah. So this is a manifesto that tells you in a satirical way how to not do it. It's a bit like, okay, if you do it, you know that you are producing B movie. Another manifesto that is not so much a manifesto as kind of a draft, kind of a treatment of a manifesto, as kind of an essay, someone writing a manifesto in the future, is Sarah Kember's feminist futurist manifesto, in the same way kind of discussing the idea of making futurism, but this time maybe a bit less male and a bit less violent. So, and then we have finally a manifesto that I also want to share with you. I have to warn you for, so to say, reader's discretion. It's a bit, I mean, it's West Coast USA language, so it is sexualized language and so on. But this is a manifesto. So the Queerius Labs, that is a makerspace and a hackerspace in San Francisco, of people who are totally fed up with the bro culture, with the culture of these kind of the maleness and technocracy in Silicon Valley. And if you read it, it clearly tells you how to not do things in the technological future. So this, I think, is a very nice alternative to the hardcore futurist manifestos, although of course people writing this manifesto are totally tech savvy and of course want to do technical things. So now the question is, what's better? Both lead kind of to horrible scenarios. Utopia, we have seen kind of the Soviet-style dictatorship within the biosphere. And you might even say, I mean, the Soviet Union was built on top of kind of utopian thinking, the idea of Marxism-Leninism, which of course is an utopia. Of the futurists, which leads to this technocratic regimes like the like technocratic regimes in Latin America, the fascists, for example, in Europe, and others. So how to build your world in the future. And I think that's a nice graffiti that I saw in Turin, actually. The point is, what you see in both sides is art can kill. I mean, if it is so inspiring that people actually say, well, let's do it that way. And maybe you come up with your own stories that are a bit more benign, but if they are not, then at least make them suspenseful.